Technology, it can be annoying. And we had a bit of a technology problem in the last class for face-to-face, which meant I didn't get through as much content as I would have liked to, which means I want to go and do a little bit more content today. But before I do that, I want to just double check with you and see if anybody has any particular questions or problems that they would like to deal with. And as I ask you that question, I'm actually going to go and have a look at I did put in a little survey. I don't know if anybody did it. What should we discuss in the next tutorial? Oh yeah, a few people have made some contributions there, which is awesome. Sorry, I'm talking to myself as I seriously am one of these nanas when it comes to using a mouse. I can't use the trackpad. Apologies for my tummy in the screen. Let me just see if I can find somewhere here to do this. Here we go. Here we go. Let's go. Boom. No, it's not going to do it. All right, let me show you some other way. Here we go. I am going to share with you the screen that I can see, which is this. And this shows me that a couple of people would be keen to work through a problem task. Content that you missed out on due to the technical issues would be amazing. That's actually what I want to do as well. So I'm going to vote that one up. And other topics that were there. The first three of those were ones that I suggested because I just wanted you to see how it worked. And somebody has added in the difference between executed and executory. So why don't, even though that is at the bottom of the list at the moment, that's probably the quick one. So if you're happy for me to do it, I'll just talk about that quickly first. And I'm just going to bring up the chat screen though so I can see anything that you guys say to me. No, it's not going to make it easy for me to do that today. Or for some reason, I can't see the chat screen. So if you want to ask me a question, you're going to need to wave like this. And if you're hiding from me, you're going to need to unmute your microphones and yell out, okay? It's low tech, but it's going to work. So executed has a number of, actually not even overly related meanings. So executed often means in the context of contract that a document has been signed. So if we say the contract has been executed, we may well mean, not exclusively, but we may mean that the parties to a contract have signed it. It's actually less common in standard parlance to say executed, the contract has been executed, to mean that the contract, the obligations under the contract have been completed. All obligations have been completed. But technically that is, the language executed there in a legal sense could mean that the obligations have been completed. Executory means yet to be done. So the reason this question came up the first time is in the quiz that we did in the classroom, and I made a version of that quiz available to those who weren't in the class. One of the questions, I think it was a true and false question from memory, but it said something along the lines of obligations in a unilateral contract are executory. So true or false? And when we did it in the classroom, my memory is that it actually came up, most people said true, but in fact the answer is false. And the reason for that is at the time that the contract is made, sorry, it's the other way around. I think most people said false, and the answer is that it is true. Have I got that around the right way? I can't remember. I know that whichever way it went, there was confusion now, and I am adding to it in this moment. So an obligation is executory if it's yet to be completed. Under a unilateral contract, it's called a unilateral contract because at the time the contract is made, only one party has any obligations. And those obligations are executory, so yet to be performed at the time the contract is made. At the time the contract is made, the offeree has already performed their obligations. And in fact, technically, the offeree has no obligations because the contract is made by them doing the thing. And at the time they do the thing, whatever the thing is, find the lost dog, provide the information required, dance up and down in an amusing manner, whatever the offerers had attached to it. And the prime example that we used was from Carlhill and Cobolic Smoke Ball, bought the smoke ball and used it in accordance with the description. So at the time that they do that thing, they have no obligation to do it. But by doing the thing as required by the offeror properly and then communicating that, the contract is made. And in fact, even saying and communicating that, Carlhill and Cobolic Smoke Ball is authority for the proposition that communication doesn't have to be immediate, that the contract will be made just doing the thing. Now, I'm not sure who asked that question. For those of you, whether you asked it or not, have I added to or detracted from your understanding of this concept?
That's good.
Good? Happy?
Yes.
I think there are some buttons that you can press. I can see somebody's chatting, but I can't see where to have a look at the chat. Oh, there it is in bright yellow. Okay, and so Erin has asked McRobinson and the Commissioner of State Taxation. So when we get to the content, I'll make sure that we have a bit of a focus on that one as well. Okay, so working backwards through the list, my proposal is that we're going to have a look at some of this content, and then if we have time, we'll have a look at a problem, and if we don't, then we will definitely do a problem next week. And by next week, those of you who have submitted a problem task tonight will also have some feedback on that task. And it is a bit of a baptism of fire. You're learning by doing. There is very little risk with having a go at these, even if I haven't stepped you through them, because for the face-to-face students, you don't get anything other than my feedback, love and admiration. There's no marks in it for you. If it's an online student, they're worth 5% of your marks overall, and that's only the best 5 will be counted. So your worst possible situation is that you don't do as well as you would have liked, and you do 5 more that you do better and this one doesn't count, or even if this one does count, the chances of you actually failing it on your first go are actually quite small. But I'll explain my reasoning for saying that later. So let me just pull up the PowerPoint again. Let's go play. There it is. And then I need to share the screen with you. Let me get the chat out of the way. Oh, Catherine. And I just need to be able to share my screen with you. Where have the controls gone? Oh, there they are. All right. I believe you should all be able to see that now. Yes? No?
Yes.
Hey. Okay. So now, oh, goodness me, forgotten to put my desks down, so I can't see where I am. Let me just fiddle in here. Let's go to where we need to be. Actually, this screen will help me. It's a lovely bouncy screen. Where we got to was woolen mills. Yeah, let's actually have a quick look at woolen mills and just make sure that everybody's in the same place. So I have no idea why we've got that little messy bit on the top of the screen, but I'm not going to let it worry me. So woolen mills is a pretty interesting case. It's a case that we'll come back to over and over again, and it demonstrates the link between acceptance and consideration. So we haven't spoken about consideration very much yet, so we'll spend a bit more time on this case when we get to consideration. For now, just think about consideration as paying a price. What's important in woolen mills here, and I'm not proposing at the moment to go through the detail of the case itself with you, but feel free to ask me if you want me to. The thing that's important to get from this case is that there is a test as to whether or not the offeror has actually requested in a unilateral contract that the offeree do the particular thing. So in this case, there was a policy of rebate to Australian manufacturers who used Australian wool. And the manufacturers used the Australian wool, they claimed, and in fact they were paid the rebate for a period of time, but then the policy changed. And in fact, woolen mills repaid some of the rebate that had been paid to it, and then thought, hang on a minute, let's try and contract, let's see if we can get that money back. And effectively what the judgment says in relation to this offer point is that the things that the woolen mills company did, it did as part of its ordinary business. It didn't do it as a direct exchange or as a consequence of a request from the government. So the offeror in this case would be the government who pays the rebate. The offeree is the woolen mills company. And when the court looked to whether or not they had done the things that they did as a quid pro quo, a term that we'll deal with more in consideration, when they looked at that, they said, no, this was actually part of their ordinary business, that the activity wasn't there to induce the person to do the act. Now that gets confusing because we look at it and we think, well, of course the government was trying to get them to use Australian wool. That was what their whole purpose of the rebate was, to get these manufacturers to use Australian wool. But even though that might have been the purpose of the rebate, there was no direct communication. And the reason that they used Australian wool was not because of the rebate, rather because they used Australian wool, they could source the rebate. So there wasn't this direct nature of an exchange. Oh, gee, that little thing is going to annoy me even more. So with a unilateral offer, a key principle here is that there needs to be a quid pro quo. But my guess is as soon as I say that, you're going to say, but what about Carlhill and Carbolic Smoke Ball? Mrs. Carlhill didn't use the smoke ball in accordance with the direction on the packet so that she could get the flu and get 100 pounds. She used the carbolic smoke ball in accordance with the directions on the packet so that she could avoid getting the flu. So there wasn't a quid pro quo in that situation either. Has anybody got any thoughts of that on that? It's terrible if I add to your confusion by pointing out something that you hadn't noticed before as well. I'm going to try and swap this screen around. It's just annoying me. Any thoughts, concerns?
I thought the condition for the carbolic smoke ball one was that the condition was that it was about not getting the flu Am I mixing things up? Yeah.
So if that's in fact the case, then on what basis is there a quid pro quo? Is there an exchange? I won't hang on that point for too long. The short answer is there is no direct exchange. We've got roughly 100 years between those two cases. Carbolic smokeball is problematic in a number of ways. It's not really a contract case. It's a product liability case. It's a misleading and deceptive conduct case. But we didn't have laws in relation to product liability when that happened. We didn't have laws in relation to misleading and deceptive conduct. So instead, the action was brought in contract, and the case is great because it summarises a number of the different contract rules. But then we end up with Australian law roughly 100 years later, not quite from memory, and we end up with this slightly different problem particularly where we've got a government agency saying, if you do this thing, we will pay you a rebate. And then the judges unpicking, well, is that actually an offer capable of acceptance in contract? And for a range of reasons, including the quid pro quo, the answer was no. Other reasons for saying that were that there wasn't this direct communication, that the recipients of the rebate were already using Australian wool. There wasn't a direct link between the offer of the rebate and the activity that they took, which is this quid pro quo point, and that it was also a policy. It wasn't intended. So when we look at this in relation to intention as well, the government didn't intend, and it couldn't be shown that the government might have intended to contract to make an enforceable promise. What it did is it had a policy that it would finance an activity in a particular way, and that policy could be changed. There are some other points in there too, including some lack of authority as a matter of constitutional law, with the parties actually having, with the government agency having ability to contract in the first place. But that's a minor point for us at the moment. Let me just bring this slide pack up again. Please don't hesitate to ask me if you have questions. I'm just going to pull that there from current slide. That is not where I want to be. Okay, sorry. Really, I'm just having a day. We wanted to bring it down here, and we will be back. Okay, let's talk now about McRobinson's case. So, sorry. Come on, Catherine, where is it? There we go. Hopefully that's sharing now. You can see that. So in McRob's case, so a couple of things to talk about here. This is a case, again, with a government agency, and in this case, it was an airline and travel agency. The travel agency was owned by the airline. So the key point for discussion in this particular case was when, and from our point of view anyway, when and where a contract was made. So does anybody have any insight as to why the Commissioner for State Taxation might have cared about that point? So it is, the Commissioner for State Taxation is saying a contract was made in Western Australia.
Well, they cared because it affected their ability to charge a duty or something on it.
Absolutely, exactly that. So what they were doing is they charged stamp duty. So we'll talk a lot more about stamp duty. Well, actually, we won't talk a lot more about stamp duty. We'll talk a lot about formalities in the second half of the semester, early in the second half of the semester. And the key formality that comes up over and over again is the requirement to have a document in writing for a contract to be enforceable. Now, often this comes up because somebody needs to charge a tax. So a tax is attached to the contract event itself. And stamp duty is a form of tax. So what actually happened in this particular case, it's important to understand the process that the business used. So if McRobinson or the travel agent, the way that they sold airfares went something like this. A passenger would go into, most likely at the time, we're talking 1975, a storefront. So probably not even telephone shopping at that stage. You'd go into the agency and say, I want to fly from Perth to Melbourne on such and such a day. The travel agent would then advise the passenger of available flights and fare prices. So might well be saying, well, there's no flights on that day, or if you want to fly on that day, it's going to cost you X. And if you fly on a different day, it will cost you Y. At that stage, passenger says, okay, I still want to go on the same day. I'm prepared to pay X, and they pay the fare. They actually pay the amount of money at that point in time. At that point, they get a ticket. The ticket, in this case, had a very broad exemption clause on the back of it. It effectively said, we can cancel the flight if we want to. If you don't show up on time, we have no obligations to you. If there's bad weather or acts of war or things that we don't expect, we can cancel this airfare. I suspect it did say some stuff about getting your money back, but it was 1975. In fact, the same year that the Trade Practices Act came into being. And so the events leading up to this case would have happened prior to the law, which the successor to the Trade Practices Act is the Competition and Consumer Law. And in fact, the most litigated provision of a piece of legislation in Australia ever is what used to be Section 52 of the Trade Practices Act, is now Section 18 of the Australian Consumer Law, which effectively says you can't mislead or deceive people in trade or commerce. And so an action like Mrs. Carlhill's carbolic smoke ball, where it said we've put £1,000 in a bank and we'll pay you with £100 if you get the flu. Or in the case of an airline ticket like this, something that says we can cancel it at any time and not give you your money back. Those kind of behaviours would be regulated by that law now. So then at the time that the flight was scheduled, the passenger turns up at the airport with their ticket, and then they're either let on the plane or they're not. So that was the process. So as Steve rightly said, the reason that this became an issue, when was the contract made, was not actually because of this broad disclaimer clause, but because the Western Australian government had a law in place that said that they could collect taxes on this kind of contract. And so if the contract was made in Western Australia, then they could collect that tax. If it wasn't made until some subsequent time, for example, if the passenger was in Melbourne, then they couldn't collect the tax in the same way. So McRobinson, or the airline, argued that by tendering the ticket, it made a written offer to the passenger, and the passenger who would retain that, if they retained the ticket without objection, paid the fare and showed up, that was actually the point in time where the contract was made. Airline makes an offer, but by doing a range of different things, including not objecting and showing up on the day, it's only when they get on the plane that the contract is actually made. They said, McRobinson said, in any event, there's no contract because the airline itself wasn't taking on any responsibility. that any contract was made on the run effectively. The State Commissioner for Taxation, on the other hand, said that there was a real mix-up here. You couldn't necessarily see offer and then match it with acceptance, that it was completely inextricably mixed up together. The words on the ticket form the agreement because they give rise to an obligation to carry the passenger. And an exemption clause could absolve them, get them out of their obligation to do so, or it could frustrate the passenger's hopes, but it didn't mean that there was no agreement. Now, it's a confusing judgment because we've got three different judges who get to the same end result. Anna's got a helper. I'm waving. They get to the same result, but they get there in different ways. So I've tried on this slide to summarise those end results. I think the big picture here is that you treat it as a group of cases that we will refer to as the ticket cases. So, and we'll come across a number of ticket cases later, particularly when we're looking at what the source of the terms of an agreement are. Once we identify whether there's a contract or not, then we need to work out what the terms are. And it's not at all unusual for onerous terms to be put on the back of a ticket or included in a ticket. And when you think about the process, anybody buying a ticket, you front up to the desk or whatever, you pay the money, you get your ticket in advance. So a couple of principles that go with all ticket cases. One is you can't add new terms when a contract has been made. So if the contract had already been made before the ticket was issued, or even at the time the ticket was issued, if the passenger doesn't know about the onerous clause, that can't be brought into the agreement itself. Now, Justice Barwick said, in fact, if the ticket is part of this agreement, it's so onerous to mean that there is in fact no obligation. And this point goes to consideration to an extent as well, that there is no, because the airline hasn't actually promised to do anything, it has no obligation, so the other party can't be bound either. And there is no contract unless both parties have obligations and both parties have rights. Justice Stephen took the more traditional ticket case approach that I was just mentioning. He says you can't add new terms after a contract is made. So the ticket, he agreed with the airline that the ticket itself was the offer. Justice Jacobs said, well, the ticket records the offer that the airline made, but then also agreed with Justice Barwick that it's a broad and onerous term. Justice Jacobs said that the offer can be accepted or rejected by the passenger when they've had time to read those conditions. So again, you will not get one principle out of this case. We've got three judges who all come to the same end result, but they get there in very different ways. So why give you such a confusing case? Firstly, it demonstrates to you that even though you can get three judges agreeing that there is or there isn't a contract, they won't always get there for the same reasons. But secondly, and probably more importantly for our point of view, the case itself sets out in a relatively succinct way a number of principles to do with the idea of offer. Chief Justice Barwick's judgment is the one that's extracted in the most depth in your case note, in your case book. And the point here is not so much this particular case, but the statements that Chief Justice Barwick makes about the way that offers work. That's the value in this case to you. Got any questions, concerns, frustrations? So I can see somebody said something in the chat. Just need to open that up and have a look at it. It's hiding from me. Right, let me bring the chat up again just to have a look and see what's there. Erin, let me just, sorry, I'll move it around so I can see it. Okay, so you're saying you can't get your mind around the idea of people playing for an offer. Your internet's a disgrace. Yes, that happens. That's one of the reasons I'm back here instead of at Mount Buller. So people are not paying for the offer. Effectively, what Justice Barwick is saying is at the time that the offer is made, the ticket is handed over, they may have already paid. So that's like a unilateral, in that case, it would be a unilateral contract because they've done everything that they need to do, but they can subsequently reject the offer, which would give rise to a right to get their money back because they haven't paid their money under a contract. Does that make sense? It's not an easy judgment to get your head around. I will completely agree with you there. And the value in it is more the general statements about the ways that offers work than the actual execution in this particular case. Let me return to, I'm assuming you can see you can still see the slides?
Yes.
Okay, I'm not going to go and do this as a quiz because we'll run out of time very quickly. But usually what I do at this point is we talk about who's making the offer in this kind of scenario. So for those of you I can see, I'll just get you to put your thumbs up if you think that the person behind the cash register here is making the offer to sell the groceries.
No.
If you think the person who is making the offer to buy groceries is a person with a red basket in their hand, show me with the thumbs up. I'm kind of leading you on here. You, Cassandra, have got a sideways thumb. I can see that you're I can see that you're hedging your bets. So basically, this is what we're doing here is we need to distinguish offers from other kinds of conduct, similar sorts of conduct. And the reason that we need to distinguish is that there are all sorts of conduct that look like offers and that lay people might think of as being offers. So as before you were a law student, before you started to do contract, when you went into a shop, I doubt that you even thought about who was offering to sell something and or whether you were offering to buy something. We tend to think about at shops are offering their goods for sale, and then we accept that offer by paying for them and leaving the shop. But technically, the party who makes the offer needs to incorporate in the offer all of the DNA of the deal. It needs to incorporate an intention to be bound. It needs to incorporate consideration, let's call that price at the moment. It needs to incorporate sufficient certainty that we know what the contract is about and that all of the important terms are addressed. In order for an agreement to be made, we need an offer to be matched with an acceptance that doesn't vary the offer in any way, and that acceptance is then communicated. And at that point, we have the meeting of offer and acceptance, and the agreement is made. Unless the offer contains all of those other things, though, it won't be an offer. And so accepting something that is not an offer will not create an agreement. So the kinds of other conduct that we're going to talk about, clearly I'm going to go to invitations to treat in a minute, and those whose thumbs I could see could understand that shop owners are inviting people to treat, inviting people to make offers to buy goods. They're not actually offering to sell in most cases. We spoke a little bit about puffs when we spoke about Carlil and carbolic smoke ball in class, and it's in the recording. One of the arguments that the smoke ball company had was, we didn't intend, this is just advertising, it was just a puff. Nobody would really believe it. And that's one of the reasons why I always try and do the calculation for how much money £100 would be in today's dollars. Because I think it does look more like a puff if you're being promised around $23,000 if you get a cold and you take these things. It does seem like a ridiculous amount of money. But in that particular case, even though they argued that it was a puff, it was held not to be. It's quite a famous case about puffery that comes up from time to time. It's actually an American case. It's Leonard and, in fact, because it's an American case, we say versus. I think it's Leonard and versus PepsiCo. Can you see how I can't say versus? I just go to say and each time. You'll find that flips in your head at some point as well. I think it's a case that's worth having a look at. I think it's discussed very briefly in your case book, but if you are to Google puff, contract law and puff, this is the case that will come up. Effectively, PepsiCo had as an advertising program that you could earn points, I think, for the bottle caps on their bottles, that the more bottles of Pepsi you drank, the more bottle caps you had, or it might have been the bottles themselves, labels, something like that. They were like frequent flyer points, frequent Pepsi drinking points, I guess, and you could translate them or exchange them for goods or services. And in their ad, they basically said if you had X million of these things, you could buy a Harrier jet, like the very high level one. And they argued, well, this was a puff. Because, of course, being America, somebody sued them. They got their millions of bottle caps, I assume, and they said, I want to be Tom Cruise, I want my Harrier jet. And, of course, PepsiCo couldn't buy one for them because, they're a military classified jet. So, and probably they never intended to. So they said, well, that's just a puff. Now, ultimately, the question then for the court was, would people reasonably have believed that this prize was an accessible prize or not? I think probably not. I can't remember. Actually, right now I'm only remembering the facts of the case. I raised this one because somebody in class last week asked me about the case. So if you have more questions about that one, please do follow up. The other two categories that we talk about or that you'll find in the textbook are supplies of information and auctions and tenders. So a supply of information, we need to be able to distinguish when a question asked about information, about an offer, is a rejection of an offer, or when information supplied about an offer or supplied about a situation is in fact an offer or not. And so the courts are looking to the question of, is there intention? Is there an offer here that objectively, we use an objective test, the party making this statement intended to be an offer capable of being accepted on its terms without variation? And again, we're using an objective test, so it actually doesn't matter what the party actually intended, rather what a reasonable person having the same information as the offeree would have believed. So we look at a couple of cases. Harvey and Facey is the key one. Look at it quite briefly. There's a slide in here. We probably won't we'll skip over it because I'm talking about it right now. But in that particular case, a potential purchaser of a property sent a telegram and said, what's the cheapest, will you sell Bumper Hall Pen? Bumper Hall Pen was the name of a property in Jamaica from memory. And what's the lowest price you'd consider? Something to those lines. The response was the lowest price would be X. So they then said, great, we'll pay you that. And then the vendors or the purported vendors said, no, 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 we didn't agree to sell the property. We just gave you some information. You asked for some information and we gave you some information. That lowest price would be dependent on a range of things, including our decision to sell. So again, it's all about distinguishing the conduct. Yeah, sorry, I'm not going to talk about that right now. We've talked about these things. So let's talk about invitations to treat. So a couple of key cases at the beginning actually come out of criminal law. So Fisher and Bell is a case where a shop had a display case, a glass display case. In the display case, they had some flick knives. So it was an offence under some legislation to offer for sale this kind of weapon. So a policeman, Mr. Fisher, I assume, can't remember whether he was at what stage it went, turns up at the shop, has a look at the flick knives, and effectively charges the vendor with offering flick knives for sale. The vendor, clearly well advised, says, actually, no, they weren't being offered for sale. This was an invitation to treat. All I was doing was displaying them, and the law of contract has said for a very long time that when I display goods for sale, they're not actually being offered for sale. The offer needs to be made by the purchaser. And the reason for that could include things like, I'm not prepared to sell flick knives to children, so I'll only accept offers from adults. If I was offering them for sale, the moment that a child said, I want to buy that flick knife at the displayed price, I would be obliged to sell it to them because the contract would be made. So in that particular case, once again, it was found that there was a display. It was a display only. It was an invitation to treat. Again, it's probably relevant here that this action was being brought under the criminal law as well, because ordinary humans would believe that things that are in a display case are being offered for sale. So even that use of ordinary term is difficult. But when we have a criminal issue, then the prosecution needs to be able to demonstrate beyond a reasonable doubt that the crime has been committed. And the crime here was to offer the knives for sale. So effectively, part of what the judges are saying in this case is, if the legislature wants to prevent something, it needs to write the legislation in such a way to make sure that it achieves that purpose, that it's not the job of the court to interpret the legislation in that way or to change the law of contract in some way to end up with that result. Yes.
Why is this under a criminal? Why is this criminal law and not civil law?
Because the legislation provided that it was an offence, a criminal offence, to offer flick knives for sale. So the police officer has gone in and said, hello, 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 what's this I can see here? You are offering flick knives for sale.
Yeah.
And the vendor has said, no, I'm not offering them for sale. The law of contract says I am just displaying them. I'm inviting people to treat with me. So people could offer to buy them, but I'm not offering to sell them. Right. Similarly, and so it was a contract point that's being determined in a criminal case. Okay. And this one is the same. This Partridge and Crittenden always makes me smile because it's about birds, and the defendant here is Mr. Partridge. But Mr. Partridge paid for advertisements in a magazine where he said Bramble Finch cocks and hens, 25 shillings each. and it happened to be an offence to sell those kind of birds, to offer. So the words were in the legislation was offer to sell, contrary to the law. So he was charged with selling contrary to law. And ultimately the court found here, no, he wasn't offering to sell, he was advertising. It was an invitation to treat. So people who came to him to buy them, they were the ones making the offer. And it's exactly the same point. So the seminal case here, even though it's an English case, is Boots Cash Chemist. So it's a 1953 case, and it's been followed many, many times in Australia. So the conduct that was being complained about happened prior to 1953. So Boots, I've got a couple of pictures on the slide there. One of a Boots Cash Chemist back in the 50s. Any of you who've been to the UK would have been past or into a Boots at some stage, I'm sure. They're like a classy version of Chemist Warehouse or Priceline, something like that, where they sell much more. It's much more than just being a pharmacy. They have makeup, and in fact in Boots you can buy shoes and vacuum cleaners. I remember in the UK there, I bought a stick blender there once. It's one of the best stick blenders I've ever bought. Hair dryers, all sorts of things. So back in the early 1950s, late 40s, they started this new business model. Up until that point in time, if you wanted to go and buy any kind of prescription drugs or any kind of over-the-counter drugs, you had to go to the pharmacy. And they set up this kind of supermarket-style, big footprint store. So the Pharmaceutical Society of Great Britain, they are effectively a guild. We'll come across these kind of cases a number of times. There's another one with the Dermatological Society that we deal with, Shahid, and the Dermatological Society of Australia in a couple of weeks' time. So a guild like this, or it's kind of like a union or a small business association, and they're bringing this action. So they represent pharmacists. There happens to be some law at the time that says there are certain kind of drugs that you can't buy without the supervision of a pharmacist being involved in the sale. So, in fact, there are plenty of drugs like that now where you don't necessarily, in Australia, where you don't necessarily need a prescription, but you can't get them without them coming from behind the counter with the pharmacist. So certain types of headache tablets, certain type of cold and flu medicine, that kind of thing. So the legislation said that it was unlawful to sell these kind of drugs unless the sale is effected by or under supervision of a registered pharmacist. So the Pharmaceutical Society of Great Britain said, well, Boots are breaking the law, because you can pick up your Panadol or its equivalent and put it in a basket and take it to the cash register. And so there isn't a pharmacist supervising the purchase. So the issue here was whether or not the sale was under the supervision or not. So Boots argued, I'll start with the plaintiff. So the Pharmaceutical Society of Great Britain argued that the drugs were purchased or a contract was made when the customer put the drugs, took them off the shelf and put them in their basket. Boots, on the other hand, said that the legislation hadn't been contravened because it was only when they took the drug to the cash register and sought to buy it that a contract could be made. That the display of the drugs on the shelf was an invitation to treat, and the offer is made at the point in time where they get to the cash register. And as it turns out, the cash registers were situated in a part of the shop where they were under the supervision of a registered pharmacist. So they said that that was enough, that the supervision at that point was enough to meet the requirement of the legislation. So at the moment, we don't really care about pharmaceutical drug dispensing legislation. Why we're looking at this case is to understand how the process of making the contract works. basically the court agreed with Boots. They said that if the Pharmaceutical Society's argument is right, that once you put something in your basket, you'd be bound to buy it at that point. And that actually it's at the point that it gets to the cash register that the pharmacist or the person at the cash register can actually reject the sale. So think about that. Buying alcohol, buying cigarettes, you can see all of those things unless there's particular laws in place, which there are now in relation to cigarettes. They have to be behind the counter. But with alcohol, for example, you can go into a bottle shop. A 15-year-old, well, a 10-year-old for that matter, can take a bottle off the shelf and walk around the shop with it. It's only at the point that they offer to buy it that the person having the liquor license can actually reject it. In fact, even buying clothes, I don't know, there could be the shop of excellent taste. I really need to go there, where when I go and buy things that don't suit me, they say, no, stop. We will not accept your offer to buy this ridiculous frilly outfit. It's going to look terrible on you. We will only accept offers from people who have good taste. So what's our takeaway here? An offer needs to be capable of ripening into an agreement. In order to ripen into agreement, the expression I use is it needs to have the DNA of the deal in it. One of the reasons we spend so long comparatively with other topics here talking about offer and acceptance is because the offer necessarily needs to carry with it intention, consideration, and sufficient certainty for us to know about that intention, to know what the price is, what the consideration is, to make sure that all of the key terms have been addressed, and to be clear on what the contract means. So an offer, in order for an agreement to be formed, an offer needs to be capable of ripening into agreement because it can't be changed by the acceptance. And the reading you've already done for the class that we'll do tomorrow has shown you that by trying to accept an offer, by varying it, you are in fact rejecting that offer and creating a new offer itself. So you can't have a conditional acceptance. I love what you're offering me, and I'll accept if you reduce the price by $10. That is actually a counter offer. It is not a conditional acceptance. Well, a conditional acceptance is not an acceptance. It doesn't work to create a contract. It just creates a counter offer. Now that counter offer might be immediately accepted and then we have an agreement. But if it's rejected, the offeree, or well, the original offeror, who is now the offeree of the counter offer, has absolutely no obligation to reinstate their original offer. So if I say to you, I really love your offer, I'll accept it if you reduce the price by $10, and you say no, and then I say, oh, okay, I'll pay the extra $10, you can just say, go away. No contract. I don't agree to that change. I'm not going to reinstate the offer. And that's particularly a trick for young players in the commercial world. And it's something that often lawyers have to remind commercial people about as negotiations are moving. And, you know, okay, well, what if we offer them this? Sometimes we need to point out, well, oh, so it's actually the commercial people very rarely say, what if we offer them this? What they'll say is, okay, I like that offer. Let's see if they'll do it for $10 less. As a lawyer, you need to say to them, well, actually, we need to word that very carefully, because if we end up rejecting the offer, then that offer might not be reinstated. And we might, so how prepared are you to lose this deal? Other things that we need to take away from this is that acceptance needs to be communicated. And we haven't spoken much about acceptance, but we need to think about that communication piece because it affects when offers can be withdrawn as well. An offer can also stipulate how it's accepted. We haven't spoken about that much as well. So if I'm just talking to you and I make an offer, unless I say something different, it should be very clear that you can accept by talking to me. But if I say to you, I'm going to make this offer, you'll need to sign up online to accept it, then the only way that you can accept it is by signing up online. But I might also provide a range of different ways. So the offer itself can incorporate the mechanism for acceptance. I think back, Gibson is a good example of this. Well, actually, it's not a good example because they didn't make an offer. But what they did is they stipulated the mechanism for the application to be made. Ultimately, whether something amounts to an offer, a request for information, or an invitation to treat will be a question of construction. In other words, the judges are going to look at the behaviours of the party, the words on the document, what a reasonable person would think was meant by the conduct, and come up with an end result. So ultimately, particularly for the assignment that's going to be released on Tuesday or possibly Wednesday, depending on how we go, you're going to need to know these rules. You're going to need to be able to think about whether behaviour is a request for information, an invitation to treat, is it puffery or is it an offer? What makes it an offer? Is it capable of acceptance? So the last thing, I'm very aware of the time, and I don't want to take too much of yours unnecessarily. The auctions and tenders piece is sort of the last section of this kind of behaviour that might look like an offer. It's actually much simpler than it looks. Particularly in relation to auctions, the important thing to understand is that the person who is making bids is the person who is making an offer. So if I am trying to sell you something and I am auctioning it, my mouse here, and I've got you all here and I'm like, will anybody bid for the amounts? I'll take anything. I'll take $1. It's on the market. Will any of you take this beautiful mouse for $1? Going, going, gone. And I point to somebody and I've sold it. I am not offering the mouse for sale. Bidders are offering to buy the mouse. And I ultimately, as the auctioneer, accept the highest bid, or I don't. Now, any of you who have been to a house auction will know that quite often the auctioneer will pass the property in, which just means that the highest bidder goes in to negotiate with the with the homeowner or the vendor of the property. But bidders are the ones who are making offers. The agent acts as an agent for the vendor. So effectively, under a contract of agency, the agent has authority from the vendor to accept bids. Usually that authority will come with, and in real estate terms, we call it a reserve price. So I can, if I'm your auctioneer, you might authorize me to accept bids up to $10 million, over $10 million. So the reserve is $10 million. While people are bidding anything under $10 million, I don't have authority to accept. Over $10 million, I can either pass it in because in my professional judgment, I believe I can get some more money out of this bidder and will take them in to negotiate, or I can just accept. I can say the property's on the market and I can accept. In the AGC Advances and McWhirter case, the property, there was actually no reserve, or there's some discussion about what happens if there's no reserve, if there's just a blanket right for the agent to sell at any price. But ultimately, that doesn't change the law. Bids are still offers.
What's the
Yeah.
difference between an invitation to treat?
Between a bid and an invitation to treat, did you say?
Like the auctioneering, wouldn't that be an invitation to treat?
Yes, the auctioneer is basically inviting people to treat.
Right.
As an agent for the vendor, usually, although that, to be frank, there's nothing to stop you going out and auctioning your own home or your own building or your own livestock. It's just, on the whole, you'd be pretty silly to do it, but stupidity never stopped people from doing things in contract law, let me tell you. So the act of an auction is actually just a form of invitation to treat. It's literally, and treat here, treat is a very old word for contract or negotiation. If I'm treating with you, I'm negotiating with you.
Right.
So
Okay.
I'm inviting you to negotiate with me or inviting you to make offers.
Yeah.
Is what that means. Sorry, I've just got there's some summary stuff on the slides. I promise you, offer and acceptance is the biggest slide pack. There's like, I think there's 130 slides in that pack. It's ridiculous. It needs a big fat cull, I think, except there's a lot of information in there that you will find really useful when you're doing your summaries later on for your exam prep. So I don't speak to all of the slides, but I find early on, my experience has been with classes that early on, even though it can be a little bit overwhelming to see such a big slide pack, that ultimately you find those notes really useful as you're navigating the reading. So hence me flipping through stuff sometimes here. I just want to mention really quickly, and I know now I have gone 2 minutes over time, and I promise I won't be any more than 5 minutes over. And please exit if you need to, and this is all being recorded, so it will be available to you. A tender is like an auction, only the bidders don't know what the other bidders are doing. So it's like a blind auction in a sense. So they're often used in government. They're often used in real estate as well. And often they're used when asking for somebody to contract with them to provide services over a period of time. So the government will often put out, well, you see them in the news all the time. There was a tender process over the last couple of years for different companies to tender to build submarines for the Australian government. So people would put together a proposal that effectively said, this is how we would build these submarines for you. This is how much we would charge you. This is how long it would take. Sometimes tenders are very loose. So I might ask people to tender to cull my slide pack for me, make me an offer. How much would you charge me to do it? How would you go about it? How would I know that you're right? Or I might actually put together a contract and a set of criteria and say, I need you to do this job. It'll take you 10 hours, or that's the maximum I'll be prepared to do it. I'll need you to sign off on these things, and I'll need you to replace X with Y, and be very specific about the work that I need done. And then you will basically just tender a price. You'll say, yes, I'd agree to sign your contract on that basis, but I'll tender a price. Ultimately, in most cases, tenders do invitations to treat. So the difference between a tender and an auction usually is that you can't know what the other people are bidding. But as I mentioned before, when it comes to any of these contract type conduct, we need to look at what the behaviour actually is in order to work out whether there is a contract or not. So a case that we look at here is Harvella. So what happened in Harvella is the Royal Trust Company, this is a Canadian case, basically asked people to submit some tenders, but when they did so, they said, we'll bind ourselves to accept the highest offer. So 2 companies tendered. Harvella said that they would bid, actually Outerbridge bid first, or at the same time. They said that they would spend, they would be prepared to pay $2.1 million. Harvella, on the other hand, said that they would pay $2.17 million, 1.175 million, or 101,000 more than the highest bid. So there was a mechanism for calculating. So basically Royal Trust said, okay, we'll go to Outerbridge and we will do that for the high. Oh, what have I done? The wrong way around. Sorry, Harvella, Outerbridge, there. This is what happens when I read my slides. Okay, Outerbridge was the one who made the bid. Harvella just bid 2.175. I need to fix that slide. I'm a bad slide maker. So they sold it to Outerbridge for the amount that Harvella quoted plus 101,000. Harvella says, well, that's not fair. You should sell it to us because we submitted the highest bid. And ultimately the court found, because of those words, if any offer made by you is the highest offer received, we bind ourselves to accept it, provided it complies with the terms, so you've agreed to our contract terms, that actually the call for tender itself was an offer. And ultimately the Outerbridge quote or price was sufficient acceptance because you could calculate that number. So just because it was a tender and it was called a tender, the way that it was put together, the conduct made it an offer. And it's you come to me with the highest price and I will sell to you. So it's not always going to be simple enough to say that's a tender, that's an auction, they're invitations to treat. Even looking at the way somebody sells something in a supermarket, your starting point will be it's likely to be an invitation to treat. But if in this particular supermarket or shop, if you put something into let's say we change the technology. You know, at the moment, the technology will allow you to go through a cash checkout and swipe your items and pay for them there. Let's say Coles or Woolworths add swiping item technology to the basket or the shopping trolley so you can swipe as you go. Now, I would think that would be quite handy. I can see how much money I'm spending as I go. But if I can't unswipe, if the next thing is I just roll out of I just go through the cashier and they automatically take money from my credit card, let's face it, the technology would allow us to do that, then the act of putting something in my basket would in fact be the acceptance of an offer to sell. It would no longer be, in that particular scenario, an invitation to treat. Now, I'm just making that up because it's a scenario I can imagine happening. And it might well be, if you're trying to develop that technology, one of the reasons why it might not happen as neatly as you think it is because supermarkets may not want to give up that piece of control that they have by accepting the offer, but maybe they would. I don't know. On that note, that is a lot of information today and on Monday. Week 3 will be a brand new week. For those of you who are in the face-to-face class, there's going to be a tech there at the very beginning. They have promised me that it's fixed. Yeah, I'm so glad you're laughing.
Good luck.
Thank you. I like to believe, I think they want to fix it. I don't think they want me hassling them, but you never know. But I'm going to come with some sort of plan B that means that we don't waste the time that we did last time. I really, really don't like wasting time, my own or yours. And we will get some activities going as well. And remember that there are desk lectures for all of these topics. So the key stuff that I've been talking about is already recorded and discussed to support your reading. Questions, concerns, frustrations? There are many, many ways to contact me, including I'm happy to stay on now for a longer conversation. I just want people to be able to go if they want to and talk to each other, bring questions to class. We'll go from there. So if any of you want to drop out, I'm going to say goodbye now. And if any of you have questions now that you want to continue on with, please let me know. I'm going to read what's in the chat there, just in case it's from Erin's dodgy internet. Oh, they have the self-scanning trolleys in the Netherlands, do they? That's really interesting. Of course, because it's the Netherlands, the law of contract will be different from the law of contract in Australia. So the Netherlands will be a civil system.
Oh.
So the rules will work differently from the common law system. But that is really interesting. The Dutch, they're so on it when it comes to technology and the law. You can do your entire divorce and property settlement online in the Netherlands these days in a way that apparently leads to significantly less nasty disputes.
Definitely.
It's really interesting. One of the things you'll find with me is I am fascinated by the way that the law is changing. I know it's very scary for lots of people, the idea that the law, you've just started to get in it and the whole profession's being disrupted and changed, but I think that's a good thing. I think it just means that smart people like yourselves will have more and more interesting things to do instead of having to just do lots of process work. Hey, we've got a little shorty with Anna. You got any questions about contract law?
Say bye.
Bye.
No no contract law questions?
Here.
All right, anybody else got any questions?
Just a passing comment. I really get a lot of value out of going through a problem task from start to finish just to see what it looks like. So,
well, how about I make you an absolute promise now that we will go through the Zeta and Susanna problem from start to finish next week.
That would be perfect. Thank you.
So that means that anybody who gets it done by midnight tonight will already have my feedback on it by then. But we can go through that problem from start to finish, and I'll give you some tips and tricks for how you might approach it.
That'd be excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry that I've had to do so much content today, but that does tend to happen early on. Anything else?
Did you finish up going skiing?
I did. I got back. I came back at lunchtime today, though.
No, I'm really
a combination of one of the people I was staying with, their kids weren't well, and it sort of made sense for them to come back. And then it was the internet connectivity up where I was staying was pretty terrible, and I didn't think it would sustain a Zoom meeting, so I thought I should come back. Okay. Got a speeding fine on my way home for my troubles, sadly.
Oh, no.
Anyway, that will teach me. So, but no, it was yesterday morning, it was stunning, and then it was all fogged in today. So I didn't mind too much because I had a really good day the day before. Quite icy though. So Sigrid, where are you from?
The Netherlands.
The Netherlands. You are from the Netherlands. Well, there's no skiing in the Netherlands, but skiing in Europe is significantly better than over anywhere in Australia.
I know, we go Christmas time always.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful. I had 2 backpackers from the Netherlands stay with me for about 6 months a couple of years ago, and I keep threatening to go and visit them. Such a lot. Never met a Dutch person I didn't like. Okay. So well organised and love life and get the most out of everything.
Yeah, just don't like the hot weather, that's all.
Yeah, see, I'm quite happy with it cold and a bit damp. Anyway, on that note, I'm assuming that we've finished questions.
Yes.
We've got, sorry, I can't see your name, person at the bottom with a painting of a dragon behind you, glasses and headphones in. Have you got any questions? Waving, yes. No questions? Ace, go and have the problem then. Use some of your time tonight to finish off a problem if you haven't done it, and I'll get cracking making sure I get feedback to you as soon as I've written you a scary problem for your assignment. Won't be that scary, I promise.
Thank you, Kath. Good night.
Okay. See you later, guys.
Bye-bye.